your question in there. You could also put it in the chat. We'll keep an eye on the chat as well. So we can let the questions pile up there and we'll get to them at the end, or you can put them in at the end. And also I'll put a link in the chat with a that goes to online sales of Eric's book so that you can pick one up if you're interested. And I'm just going to say a few words by way of introduction about our speaker tonight, and then we'll begin. Before best-selling author Eric Jay Dolin started writing books, he worked as an analyst and program manager for state and federal environmental agencies, as well as a curatorial assistant in the mollusk department at Harvard University's Museum of Comparative Zoology and an intern at the National Wildlife Federation. Throughout that career, Dolin realized how much he enjoyed telling the stories he found intriguing and started to write them. To date, he's written 60 articles and published 14 books, including A Furious Sky in 2020. His books focus on America's great maritime history and have received many awards and honors. In addition, Dolin has received several fellowships, including being named a Nantucket Historical Association Research Fellow, and he also received an NHA Verney Fellowship to assist him in writing his book, Leviathan. Eric Jay Dolin joins us tonight from Marblehead, Massachusetts, where he lives with his family. And please join me in welcoming Eric Jay Dolin.
Thank you very much. Let me just share the screen and then I'll get started. Portion of screen share. And then I have to hit, wait a sec, slideshow, presenter view. There we go. Anyway, thank you very much for that introduction, Amy. I appreciate it. I wish I was there in person. I love being on Nantucket and visiting Nantucket, and I hope that in the future I will be able to come back. Since my slides are on, you can't see it. I was going to show you something. Many years ago when I was in Nantucket, I bought a little engraving of two seashells. It was over my shoulder, but now you can't see it. Anyway, thanks again. And I am going to begin the talk. In writing this book, I came across many fascinating stories about hurricanes, of course. One of them involved the Great Colonial Hurricane of 1635, which struck New England in middle of August of that year. And right before the hurricane struck, there was a ship, small vessel called the Watch and Wait, which was departing from Ipswich, Massachusetts, heading to my hometown of Marblehead, Massachusetts. On board, there were 23 people, including Anthony Thacker and his wife and 4 of their children. When the Watch and Wait was abreast of Cape Ann, the hurricane roared in. It sent the ship up on the rocks off of an uninhabited island. The ship broke apart. Everybody on board was killed, except for Anthony Thacker and his wife, who managed to struggle to shore. They were there for 5 days, subsisting on a round of cheese and some other food that had floated ashore. And then finally a fisherman came by, picked them up, excuse me, brought them to the mainland. And when the Massachusetts legislature found out about their travails, they were quite upset about it, and they decided to give Anthony Thacker the island upon which he had foundered, which we know as Thacker Island, which is part of Rockport, Massachusetts. Excuse me, I just have allergies, so occasionally my voice gets get a little hung up. Anyway, then there's this story from the Miami hurricane of 1926. A little bit north of Miami was Fort Lauderdale, and there was a husband and wife who were in their house when the hurricane struck. The roof of the house collapsed on the two of them. It pinned him under the rubble, and she tried to keep his head up to keep him from drowning as the water continued to rise. Excuse me, wow. So she knelt next to him, and he begged her to leave, and she didn't want to leave. She kept his head up. The water continued to rise. He begged her once again. So finally, she gave him a kiss, goodbye, left the demolished structure, and unfortunately, he died. Then there's this story from the Great Hurricane of 1938, which struck on September 21st, 1938, there was a man on the tip of Long Island who had been waiting for a package expectantly. It had within it a gleaming new barometer that he'd been waiting for from Abercrombie and Fitch. That morning, the morning of September 21st, the package arrived. He opened it excitedly, and then when he pulled the barometer out, he got very angry because the needle on the barometer was pointing to a reading that was so low, it could only mean one of two things. Either a hurricane was already there or one was fast approaching. But when he looked outside, he saw that the sky was blue, the sun was shining, and the waters were calm. So he sat down to write an angry letter to Abercrombie and Fitch. And then he went off, he drove to the post office to mail the letter. He shouldn't have been so rash, because by the time that he returned, his house and his precious barometer were washed away. Now, A Furious Sky contains many more tragic stories like these, but it is much more than a litany of death and destruction. It also weaves together a great range of captivating themes. There's the intriguing history of meteorology, the influence of hurricanes on the course of empire, the outcomes of war, and the fortunes of individuals adds to the story. Critical innovations in communication, aviation, computer, and satellite technology play an important part, as does the women's movement and its role in the naming of hurricanes. In the end, the history of America's hurricanes forces us to confront thorny questions about how we can learn to survive and adapt to the continued barrage that is sure to come from the greatest storms on earth. Excuse me, I have to tell you, I was telling Amy before I gave this talk, I gave a talk yesterday up in Lake Sunapee, and I have pretty bad allergies, and my voice kept getting caught. So I apologize for the clearing of my throat. But anyway, hurricanes are an inevitable and painful part of the American experience. If you're among the many tens of millions of people who live on the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, or Hawaii, you can expect to have your area, your region, and maybe your location visited by a hurricane. The hurricane season officially runs from June 1st through the end of November. We're right now at the peak of hurricane season, and it looks like we're going to continue to have a very active year. In an average year, 6 hurricanes dance over the Atlantic, 3 of which are major hurricanes, which is defined as a hurricane having sustained winds of at least 111 miles per hour. Typically, 2 hurricanes make landfall in an average year, and a major one pummels us once every 2 years. Now, hurricanes are not equal opportunity offenders. While 21 coastal states have been hit by hurricanes at one time or another, the states of Florida, the residents of Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Louisiana, and South Carolina take the brunt of the punishment, with Florida alone accounting for 40% of all hurricane strikes. Here in New England, we can expect to have a landfalling hurricane about once every 10 years. We are well overdue. The last landfalling hurricane was Hurricane Bob in 1991. And when I say landfall, that is defined as when the eye of the hurricane crosses the coastline. So Hurricane Sandy, which a lot of you remember back in 2012, caused a lot of devastation up here, but the eye of the hurricane and the landfall was actually much further to the south in New Jersey. Now, hurricanes have left an indelible mark on American history. Since 1980, they have accounted for roughly 50% of the cost of all natural disasters in the United States that have exceeded $1 billion. And going back to the late 1800s, hurricanes have killed at least 30,000 people. Now, Furious Sky is the history of the hurricanes that have struck what is today the United States. But before going any further, I need to define a basic term. What is a hurricane? Simply put, hurricanes are violent, swirling storms with sustained winds of at least 74 miles per hour. They generally form where the ocean's upper layer, down to about 150 feet, reaches the trigger temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit, providing the heat energy necessary to fuel the storm. 2 other conditions necessary for hurricanes for a hurricane to thrive are low vertical wind shear, which keeps the hurricane from being ripped apart, and an abundance of warm, moist air rising from the ocean's surface. As that moist air rises, it cools and condenses into clouds and precipitation. But in that process, it releases something called the latent heat of condensation, which is the real fuel source for the hurricane. Hurricanes can be anywhere from tens of miles in diameter to nearly 1,000, and they can reach up into the sky 50,000 feet. They rotate in a counterclockwise direction in the northern hemisphere and a clockwise direction in the southern hemisphere. They're characterized by extremely low pressure and a relatively calm center called the eye, with the most ferocious winds occurring in the eye wall. And this image shows you the eye wall of, I think it was Hurricane Katrina. Now, hurricanes have had a significant impact on the course of colonial history. For example, 2 strong hurricanes struck the Caribbean in the summer of 1780, killing more than 22,000 people and destroying scores of British and French naval vessels who were in the area, using it as a staging ground. Now, this massive destruction caused the French fleet to decide that they didn't want to be around during the next hurricane season. So in the winter of 1780, 1781, they repaired their ships as best they could. And then in the summer of 1781, the French went north. And they did so for 2 reasons, one of which I already mentioned, which was to escape the brunt of the hurricane season in the Caribbean. But they also wanted to go north to aid their allies, the Americans, in their fight against the British. Now, by following this course of action, the French played a key role in the crucial Battle of the Chesapeake and the ultimate American victory over the British in the Battle of Yorktown, which ended when Lord Charles Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington on October 19th, 1781. That wasn't an end to the war, but it did sort of kickstart negotiations, peace negotiations. Now, of course, hurricanes didn't cease with the formation of the new nation. And over the past 238 years, there have been hundreds of hurricanes that have affected America. And one of them was the Great September Gale of 1815, which is just a hurricane by another name, which struck eastern Long Island and New England and caused the most damage in Providence, Rhode Island. This painting was done a couple of years after the hurricane struck, and it supposedly depicts what downtown Providence looked like at the height of the hurricane. And I went to undergraduate at Brown University, and right down the street is the Rhode Island School of Design. And one of their buildings has 2 plaques on the side of it. One plaque, which is well over my height, says this is the height to which the waters rose during the Great September Gale of 1815. And then there's another plaque that's about 1.5 feet higher that says this is how high the waters rose during the Great Hurricane of 1938. Now, the Galveston Hurricane of 1900 leveled the city and killed at least 6,000, perhaps as many as 10,000 people, making it the deadliest natural disaster in American history. The Labor Day Hurricane of 1935 ripped through 3 government work camps located in the Florida Keys, killing hundreds of World War I veterans who were there to build a highway to Key West. It is still the most intense Category 5 hurricane to hit the United States mainland, with maximum sustained winds of 185 miles per hour and gusts of well over 200 miles per hour. At one of the work camps, a doctor came upon a veteran named Elmer Cressberg, who was impaled by a 2x4 that went clear through his chest underneath his ribs. Amazingly, given the circumstances, he was relatively calm. The doctor came up and said, "I can give you some morphine to help dull the pain." Elmer said, "I don't want any morphine. What I really want are 2 drinks, because I know I'm going to die when you pull these boards out of my chest." So they quickly found 2 beers, gave them to Elmer. Elmer drank them. Then he looked at the doctor and he said, "Now pull." The doctor did, and Elmer died. The Great Hurricane of 1938 delivered a body blow to New England, resulting in damages of $300 to $400 million and killing 680 people, making it the most devastating natural disaster ever to strike New England. Actress Katharine Hepburn was at her family's Victorian summer house in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, when the hurricane roared in. She and 4 other people in the house managed to escape as the house was being ripped apart and torn from its foundation. They sought refuge at a nearby inn, which was on higher ground. Looking back, Hepburn would later recall, we saw the house slowly turn around and sail off to the northeast and start down the brook, which fed the swamp lagoon. It just sailed away, easy as pie. Later, she called her father in Hartford. When she told him that the house was gone, he responded, I suppose you didn't have brains enough to throw in a match before it disappeared. I'm insured for fire. Now, we have to thank the hurricane of 1938 for giving us beautiful fall foliage throughout much of New England. This is a picture of fall foliage in Vermont, because the hurricane, which is also known as the Long Island Express, was moving at between 50 and 60 miles an hour when it plowed into the coast. And with all that forward momentum, it went well into the heart of New England with serious sustained winds. In fact, by the time that it reached Mount Washington, it knocked the cog railway off of its rails, and it toppled more than 1 billion pine trees. Now, pine trees are very good at taking over the canopy and keeping light from making it to the ground, the floor of the forest. Once those pine trees were knocked down, suddenly there was plentiful light, which was particularly good growing conditions for deciduous trees, ones with leaves that lose their leaves every year. So all these maples and oaks and other trees grew up where the pine trees were knocked down. And those are the ones that give us these glorious fall colors. Hurricane Camille in August of 1969 clobbered coastal Mississippi. Of the many people who suffered during Hurricane Camille, none had a greater burden to bear than Paul Williams Sr., the caretaker of the Trinity Episcopal Church in Pass Christian, Mississippi. The night that Camille came ashore, Paul, his wife Myrtle, and most of their children chose not to evacuate, but rather to stay in the auditorium attached to the church, which you can see here on the left. The hurricane demolished the auditorium, and in the end, 11 of Paul's children perished, along with 1 grandchild and his beloved wife, Myrtle. Hurricane Andrew struck Miami on August 24th, 1992. It tore a 30-mile wide swath of misery and destruction through Miami-Dade County. A staggering 126,000 homes were damaged or destroyed, making 160,000 people homeless overnight. Total damages reached $27 billion. Zoo Miami was especially hard hit. About 300 rare birds were lost when the aviary was destroyed. And the staff at the zoo decided to save the Caribbean flamingos by herding them into one of the men's rooms. And that's the picture that you see here. Hurricanes rarely strike Hawaii, but there have been a few of note. The most memorable being Hurricane Iniki, which made landfall on the Hawaiian island of Kauai on September 11th, 1992. It killed 6 people and cost $3.1 billion. It also forced director Steven Spielberg to cancel the final day of shooting for the film Jurassic Park. Everyone associated with the movie crammed into the ballroom at the Westin Kauai Hotel to take shelter from the storm. At the height of the hurricane, Steven Spielberg, ever the director looking for a great shot, took one of the cameramen down to the shoreline to take film of the massive waves pounding the coast. And finally, the security team at the Westin Kauai came down and pleaded, in fact, ordered Steven Spielberg and his crew and his cameramen to come back to the hotel because their lives were in danger. And if you've seen the movie, there is a scene that shows, I think it's Isla Nubla being pounded by waves. And that's actual footage from Hurricane Iniki. Now, the crew survived, and a few weeks later, Spielberg and a couple of the actors went to Oahu to film the final scene because all of the sets on Kauai had been destroyed. At the end of August 2005, Hurricane Katrina ravaged parts of Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, costing $125 billion, making it the most expensive hurricane ever in United States history. It left about 1,800 people dead in Mississippi and Louisiana, with Louisiana claiming the lion's share. Ground zero for Katrina was the city of New Orleans, which suffered the most devastating blow. Multiple levee failures around the city let the water rush in. 80% of the city was submerged in water that was up to 10 feet deep. And unfortunately, even though we spent, when I say we, the state of Louisiana and mostly the federal government spent on the order of $90 billion fixing the levee and wall system and pump system that surrounds and protects New Orleans. In 2019, the Army Corps of Engineers, who built most of those facilities, shared some very bad news in the Federal Register in the form of a report that showed that the walls and levees had been sinking due to subsidence. And unfortunately, the level of protection that they thought that those walls and levees and pumps were going to be able to provide was not available. And they're right now trying to figure out what to do to shore up the system so it could at least handle another Category 3 hurricane like Katrina if it comes ashore. 7 years after Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy struck New Jersey and New York on Monday, October 29th, 2012, killing more than 150 people and resulting in $65 billion in damage. Because it struck right before Halloween, it was dubbed the Halloween Horror and the Frankenstorm. Sandy's waves pounded the shore with such force that their vibrations were picked up 2,500 miles away by seismographs in Seattle, Washington. New York City was particularly hard hit. Many subway lines and automobile tunnels were flooded. At one point, close to 1 million Con Edison customers in and around the city lost electricity. And the hits just kept on coming. The 2017 hurricane season was one for the record books. In the end, there were 10 hurricanes, 6 of which were major. 4 of those hurricanes roared ashore. But what really set 2017 apart was that 3 out of the 4 hurricanes that made landfall in the United States were major ones. Each of those were Category 4s with winds of at least 130 miles per hour. Never before had there been 3 Category 4s to strike in a single year. The damage attributed to Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria totaled $265 billion, the most expensive hurricane year or season ever. And these hurricanes actually had a big impact on this book. I've written 14 books, and every single book, with the exception of 2, were based on ideas that I had come up with. This is one of the 2. Right after the hurricane season of 2017, which really imprinted itself into the American psyche because we saw nonstop coverage of these monster storms. It also got my editor at W.W. Norton and the head of sales to get quite interested in the concept of having a book on the history of America's hurricanes. And they thought that I'd be a good person to write it because a number of my books span multiple centuries and are able to weave all that history together in an easy to read narrative. So they reached out to my agent and asked do you think Eric would want to write a book on the history of America's hurricanes? He sent me an email and asked me that question. And I said, I had no idea. I didn't know a lot about hurricanes other than what I'd seen on the news when they come roaring ashore. So I went off for about a month and I read a bunch of books on hurricanes. I watched a bunch of Weather Channel documentaries on hurricanes, and I decided that hurricanes were fascinating and they would provide the narrative backbone for telling a broader history of America. So that's how this book came to being. But back to 2017. Hurricane Harvey dumped more than 50 inches of rain in Houston within 48 hours, and it doused Netherland, Texas, with a shocking deluge of 60.8 inches, the record for a single storm in the United States. Hurricane Irma maintained winds of 185 miles per hour for an astonishing 35 hours over the open Atlantic, another record for sustained wind speed. Irma destroyed 50% of Florida's orange crop. Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico as a powerful Category 4 with winds of 155 miles per hour, and it dumped up to 3 feet of water in some areas. Maria damaged or obliterated virtually every man-made structure on the island outside of the capital of San Juan, and many of them within the city's limits. It left 3.4 million people, the entire population of Puerto Rico, without electricity. And many of those customers were without electricity for months, even in some cases up to a year. The death toll for Maria has spawned considerable controversy, with estimates ranging from about 1,400 to more than 4,600. Now, while A Furious Sky details some of the most destructive hurricanes to reach our shores, it also recounts pivotal discoveries over the past 3 centuries in the fields of meteorology, aviation, and communications, which have greatly improved our ability to understand, monitor, and report on hurricanes. For example, after studying a hurricane in 1743, Benjamin Franklin, our founding father and founding scientist, became the first person to understand that hurricanes had forward movement, and that a hurricane's winds could blow contrary to the direction in which the hurricane was moving. During the Great Storm controversy in the mid-1800s, arguments between amateur and professional meteorologists got quite nasty, but they also helped to develop the basic image of the hurricane as a mass of swirling, moisture-laden winds, the velocity of which greatly increases as one travels towards the center of the storm and the beautiful and calm eye. The advent of the telegraph by Samuel Morse, then the radio, followed by hurricane hunter planes, which fly directly into the hurricane to give us real-time data, and Earth orbiting satellites all contributed mightily to our ability to track hurricanes from inception to dissolution. Such advances, combined with vast improvements in computer-based weather prediction models, which can run millions of equations in seconds, means that we have advanced warnings of a hurricane's strength and the timing of its arrival. Now, one of the things in researching this book, all of my books have been on topics that I didn't know a lot about before I started writing them. So it's sort of like getting a master's degree in that subject every 2 years. And one of the things that fascinated me the most were these hurricane hunter planes. I had thought when I began research on the book that it would be incredibly dangerous to fly a plane voluntarily into the heart of a hurricane. But actually, one of the hurricane hunter pilots said that the most dangerous time for him is driving to the airport or the airfield and climbing the stairs into the airplane. And in fact, even though there have been many, many thousands of hurricane hunter flights since the 1950s, only 6 of them have been lost, killing all the crew on board. And 5 of those were in the Pacific Ocean, where they were chasing typhoons, which is just another name for a hurricane in that ocean. We call hurricanes in the Atlantic hurricanes. The only plane in the Atlantic to go down went down during Hurricane Janet in 1955, and the entire crew was lost. Now, there have also been dramatic changes in the way that we identify hurricanes. In 1953, the Weather Bureau, the precursor to the National Weather Service, began naming hurricanes after women. This decision angered many who thought it was inappropriate, if not downright insulting, to name hurricanes in this manner, and they asked the Bureau to reconsider. One woman said she would rather have an unnamed hurricane hit her house than a storm named after one of her husband's former girlfriends. The Bureau, however, would not be swayed, It stuck fast to its naming system, making it permanent in 1956. Protests died down. That is until Roxy Bolton spoke up. She's shown here on the left with former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Bolton was the vice president of the National Organization for Women, and she was based in Florida. In 1970, she urged the National Weather Service to stop naming hurricanes after women. She was tired of reading and hearing media accounts in which female-named hurricanes were variously described as witches, capricious, furious, bad girls, unladylike, vicious, and treacherous. She said women are human beings and deeply resent being arbitrarily associated with disaster. Bolton offered some alternatives. Hurricanes could, she said, be named after birds, or perhaps after senators, since they so much liked having things named after them. She even recommended that hurricanes be called hemicanes instead. The service refused to budge. Then, during Jimmy Carter's presidency, U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Dr. Juanita Krebs, the first woman appointed to that position, and also an avowed feminist, decided to take up Bolton's cause. And in 1979, gender equality won out over tired bureaucracy. From that point forward, Atlantic tropical storms and hurricanes would alternate between male and female names. But as you know, we had a particularly active hurricane season last year. We went through the entire list of 21 male and female names. And the World Meteorological Organization, who manages the naming scheme, had the system in place that if we exceeded the 21 name list, we would go to the Greek alphabet. So last year we had some hurricanes and tropical storms named after letters in the Greek alphabet. Apparently, a lot of people complained about this. So the World Meteorological Organization, after last season, decided that we will no longer go to the Greek alphabet should we exceed 21 named storms. Instead, we will go to a second list of 21 named storms. And given that we are right now, I think, on the 17th named storm, and the hurricane season still has a fair bit to go, my guess is that we're going to go through 21 names and have to go to the next list. Now, the cycle continues. Every year, a new hurricane season unfolds. No matter what an individual hurricane season brings, one thing is certain. The United States will continue to be pummeled by these tremendous storms. And because of global warming, hurricanes in the future are very likely to be worse than those of the past. Global warming has already made the impact of hurricanes worse. Because sea level has risen as a result of the thermal expansion of the oceans and the melting of the glaciers, storm surges associated with hurricanes are higher. For example, off of New York City, 100 years ago, the average height of the ocean was an entire foot lower than it is today. And if you're starting from a higher platform, the waves and hurricane surge just can go that much higher and that much further inland. A growing number of studies have found strong evidence linking global warming to increased precipitation during hurricanes. The reason is that warming leads to more evaporation, and warmer air is able to contain higher concentrations of moisture, which can come down as rain. Considerable research also predicts that warmer oceans, which provide more heat energy to fuel the hurricane, will make future hurricanes more intense, stronger, higher winds. There is also some research that shows that a warmer world will result in less vertical wind shear. So vertical wind shear often rips hurricanes apart and keeps them from getting stronger, or sometimes just breaks them totally apart. If there's less vertical wind shear, that is a problem. So in the future, the research shows that hurricanes are likely to be wetter and stronger. Now, at this moment, nobody can say with absolute certainty exactly how hurricanes will change over time as a result of global warming. Scientists who are by nature conservative would be the first to admit that there are still many unknowns, as well as limitations in data and modeling, that make it exceedingly difficult to predict how hurricanes will change in a warmer world. The mounting scientific consensus that an increase in global warming will likely make future hurricanes worse, however, is not encouraging. Indeed, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out with a major study just a few months ago in which it said that it is likely that the rise in the number of major hurricanes over the last 4 decades was due in part to human-induced warming, and that it also has a high level of confidence that in the warmer world of the future, hurricanes will be wetter and more intense. But even if global warming causes no difference at all in hurricane behavior, society still has to grapple with a hurricane-filled future. And as more and more people move to the coasts, the potential impact of hurricanes will only increase. As this book was heading into the final stage of production, Hurricane Dorian riveted the nation. This was in 2019. Beginning in late August of that year, Americans watched the round-the-clock, often breathless coverage of this rapidly intensifying storm as it marched slowly across the Atlantic. Each day, reports became more alarming as Dorian not only grew into a monster Category 5 hurricane, but also appeared to be heading directly for the East Coast of the United States. But first in line were the Bahamas, parts of which were utterly destroyed by Dorian, which essentially stalled in place for an excruciating 40 hours, destroying the island of Abaco, before moving on as a Category 2 hurricane. Some models said that it would still strike the United States, prompting mandatory evacuations from Florida to Virginia. Over the next few days, Dorian hugged the coastline, briefly regaining Category 3 status as it moved over the warmer waters of the Gulf Stream, then dropping to Category 1 just before making its only landfall in the United States at Cape Hatteras in North Carolina. After that, Dorian zoomed off in a northeasterly direction, and it struck Nova Scotia, where it knocked out power to 400,000 people. And what's interesting, this hurricane season that we're living through right now, there have been, I think, 2 storms already that have missed the East Coast and gone right up to Nova Scotia and causing a lot of problems up there. So I'm sure the news coverage up there is quite interesting for this summer of hurricanes that don't often make it that far in tropical storms. Now, while Dorian's impact on the United States was significant, it was virtually nothing compared with what happened to the Bahamas and what would have happened if the hurricane had plowed head on into the East Coast of the United States instead of skirting the mainland, clipping North Carolina before sailing off towards Nova Scotia. This time, America was lucky. But if the history of US hurricanes tells us anything, it is that such luck will not last. And here's my last slide. This is me when I had brown hair back in 1991. This is right after Hurricane Bob, which a lot of the people watching probably have some memory of, the last landfalling hurricane in New England. My wife worked for the state of Massachusetts on a tree planting program, and they asked her to go down to Falmouth to see what the damage was to the trees. We actually saw this one little grove of pine trees that had been hit by a microburst, and there were like hundreds of pine trees that were knocked down like matchsticks in a swirling pattern. But then we went over to the coastline, and this is right next to, on the other side of this summer cottage, which was destroyed by the hurricane, is the bike path and the path for the Woods Hole road race, which I ran a couple of times back then. And anyway, so we saw all the damage. It was pretty traumatic. And I will have to say that that was one of my favorite shirts, that Hawaiian shirt, which I no longer have, unfortunately. But with that, I'm done with my talk. I would be happy to answer any questions. I'm going to hit stop share. So I should end the show, and I should be back. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Oh, now you can see it. Look over my right shoulder, right up, right there. That's a beautiful colored lithograph from the 1850s. It shows a Example, Spondylus americanus, a bivalve that's really beautiful. And down below is Nautilus pompilius. Anyway, I remember I got that right after Leviathan, the history of whaling in America came out. And I gave a talk at one of your sister institutions, the Whaling Museum. And my wife and I were walking down one of the main streets, and there was a store there in Nantucket that sold old prints. It might be there for all I know still. And I bought that print sort of as a present to myself after finishing the book. But anyway.
Cool. Thank you. I guess it's a little off topic, but I'm a little fascinated that you worked as a curator in the mollusk department at a museum. What kind of work does that entail?
Oh, well, when I was a kid, I wanted to grow up and be Jacques Cousteau, and I got very interested in seashells. In fact, when I was in high school, one of my first forays into serious writing was I wrote a 140-page paper for while I was in my AP biology class on the mollusks of Long Island Sound. And 2 chapters of it got published in a seashell magazine. So I was really serious. In fact, when I went to Brown, the Brown Alumni Monthly did an article on me when I was a freshman, saying the admissions office called him Shell Man. So I thought I was going to become a professional malacologist. And if you could see the rest of my office here, I've got about 300 seashells over there. I've got one over my shoulder, but I've got cabinets of seashells. I used to be a very serious collector. I know a lot about seashells. And when I was in college, I wanted to work on seashell taxonomy. So I got this job at the Museum of Comparative Zoology, working with some of the greatest malacologists of that time. And my job was to key out or do taxonomy on shells that were brought back by the professors, Dr. Ruth Turner and Ken Boss. And one of the places that they went to was Australia. And they came back with, big milk jugs, look like those steel milk jugs at the top.
Yep.
They came back with those filled with live shells that had been killed and preserved in formaldehyde. So my job was to take the shells and the animals within out of the containers and then get their genus and species and write up a card about them. So I always say, if I have any, medical problems or quirks or anything, I can always blame it for an entire summer without wearing gloves. Back then, I guess we weren't concerned about cancer as much, or the formaldehyde link. I had my arms covered in formaldehyde for days and days on end. So it's amazing that I don't have a third ear. So that is what I did for a whole summer. And I actually took a year off of school, and I worked at Woods Hole Oceanographic as well. I also worked for the old Senator Lowell Weicker from Connecticut, a liberal Republican, which we don't have anymore, but New England Republican. And I worked on acid rain legislation, which is really cool. But that's what got me interested in environmental issues. I decided I wouldn't be a very good scientist. I didn't do very well in my chemistry class. And I didn't really like lab work, but I liked environmental policy. So that's why I went on to get a degree in biology and environmental policy. And I got a master's at Yale in environmental policy. And I got a PhD in environmental policy at MIT, but I never used it for what I went to school for, which was to be a professor, because by the time I got out of MIT, I didn't want to go into academia anymore. So if you ever saw my resume, I've had a lot of jobs. You'd think I couldn't keep a job, which may be true. I do get bored easily, but luckily in the late 1990s is when I decided I wanted to be a full-time writer. And by a fortuitous accident of events, the most important of which was marrying my wife, who's been very supportive of my writing career and other things, I was able to quit my regular job and become a full-time writer in 2007. So that's a very long, totally unrelated answer to a simple question about what is it like to do malacological work in a museum.
But I think you could probably successfully argue that all of the skills and information that you learned in your education and your different jobs are perfect for writing books. It sounds like a logical transition.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, a lot of my books, some of my books have an environmental component or a natural history component. So I still like to do that. Yeah, getting a PhD helped me with research. I'm pretty good at researching and writing, but I wish I could go back. The one thing I would like to do, I mean, I like the way I write. That's good. It'd be horrible if I hated the way I write. But the last English class I took was when I was in high school, and I've never taken creative writing or any writing classes. I didn't take any in college, so my writing, whatever skills I have, they sort of came from practice, which is fine. But also history. I love history, but very oddly, I only took one history class in college, and it was when I was a freshman. So if I could go back knowing what I do now, I probably would have taken more history classes just because it would give me a broader range of knowledge. But then again, maybe that's not the way to do it. Because as I said, I pick topics that I'm interested in learning about that I don't know much about, which is a lot of things because I didn't read deeply in history when I was going through all my education. Now I do.
Right.
So maybe being a little naive and not being a trained historian has given me a little more latitude or flexibility or curiosity to just pursue what I'm interested in. But I don't want to leave your viewers with the idea that writers can do whatever they're interested in, because there have been quite a few book topics that I've proposed to my agent and various publishers that they've said, absolutely not, we're not interested in publishing that. So I've had to go to another topic. So
Right.
you can't always do what you want when you're a writer. You have to have a combination of a topic you like, but a topic that a publisher thinks will sell.
Right.
Which is the intersection's not always
Yeah.
clear.
It's a balancing act between creativity and commerce.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, because it is a job in the end.
Right. So we do have some questions here. So
Okay.
let's ask them. I see better without my glasses. So Dennis asked, with Hawaii sitting in the middle of the Pacific, why is it that only a few direct hits have impacted the island?
Well, think about how big the Pacific is. It's enormous. So anything traveling across the Pacific, whether it's a ship or a hurricane, the odds of it hitting these very small islands is little to begin with. But there's also a lot of wind shear in the Pacific around the Hawaiian Islands, and the ocean temperature is cooler than it is in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. So there's not as much of that fuel for the hurricanes when they get that far north. I mean, you don't think of Hawaii as being far north, but much further south off of Baja, California or something, where it's warm water. You occasionally get hurricanes and tropical storms spinning up there, but they tend to go across the Pacific at a much lower latitude. So that's why it's a combination of it being so small that the odds are that things are going to miss it anyway, and not as much warm water at a great depth and more vertical wind shear to disrupt the hurricanes and storms as they travel across the Atlantic. There's only been one hurricane that hit California, and it was in 1858, and it was San Diego. We don't have a lot of information about it, but again, the same reasons, but also the prevailing winds tend to push things away at that low latitude of California.
This might be an off the wall question, but with changing climate conditions, would that make the conditions more ripe for West Coast hurricane landfalls?
Oh, absolutely. If the waters get warmer, absolutely. And you could see what's happening in the East Coast. Water is warmer further north. For a hurricane to travel north to New England, it needs a lozenge of warm water, because if you have cold water, it's going to sap the strength of the hurricane. So as we have warmer waters, which we do here in the Gulf of Massachusetts and off Nantucket, you basically have a heat highway that hurricanes and tropical storms can take advantage of. So in the future, based on the research that's been done and all the studies, not only are we going to get hit by other hurricanes, which just statistically is going to happen, but it might be that they're going to retain more of their strength further north because the fuel is there. And as many people on Nantucket and Massachusetts and just New England, anybody near the coast knows that warmer waters have already caused other dramatic changes. Lobsters are migrating further north. Ones in the south are getting shell disease and other problems. Fish are migrating further north. So fisheries that once were huge in the Gulf of Massachusetts and off Massachusetts have been hurt a little bit, but a lot of those fish, to the extent that they're still there, have migrated and now they're off Canada or the maritime provinces. So we're seeing dramatic changes, and you may have heard there's been some research that seems to point to the fact that the Gulf Stream might shut off in the future. It has in the past, and that will be very interesting. It'll cause a much colder Europe. It might actually be good for hurricanes up north because there won't be as much warm water going up the coast, but it'll cause other dramatic changes. Maybe we'll live in a colder climate. So things can, the environment's dynamic. The weather, you can't predict things with certainty. But as somebody who has a science background, and I have a thing framed over here. You can't see it. I got a beautiful framed plaque from the Nobel Prize Committee because I wrote one of the chapters. I contributed to the 2007 IPCC report that won Al Gore a Nobel Prize. So since I was one of the people who worked on it, it was very nice. They sent this beautiful thing. But I was just a very minor role. But what I'm saying is I know a little bit about the science of global warming, and I'm cautious enough to realize we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the evidence is pretty overwhelming that we're heading for a more dangerous, more volatile hurricane future. And as humans, we'll learn to adapt to whatever happens, and maybe we'll take actions to forestall some of the worst changes. I don't know.
Yeah, it seems like there's more questions than answers around climate change.
Yes. Yeah.
So here's a question from Sharon. Thank you for this fascinating book. Other than knowing in advance to leave our home, are we better off today dealing with hurricanes as we were in the past?
Absolutely. I mean, in the past, hundreds of years ago, they didn't know they were coming until they hit. We have, advanced warning of where they're going, even though there's some, things can change 50 miles, 100 miles right as they're ready to come landfall. So we don't have perfect knowledge, but yes, we have incredible warnings of where the storms are going. So it gives us a much increased capacity to take evasive actions, or just to prepare your house. If you live on the coast or even inland, maybe putting shutters up or taking furniture in from the outside, just doing a lot of little things that people who are caught off guard may not have been able to do. So yes, we're in much, much better shape, but that still doesn't mean there are millions of people who totally ignore warnings. And there are some people who love to go out and surf during hurricanes and go down to the shore. It's like a magnet. So I wouldn't recommend that. And here in Massachusetts, I mean, Nantucket, you're a spit of sand. You're not very stable. I mean, in a couple thousand years, you can be gone just because of erosion. And a hurricane hits Nantucket, it's going to be major problem for all the people who live on the edge of the island. Already the sand, a lot of the cliffs are collapsing just with normal wave action. And a nor'easter, does a number on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Here in Marblehead, where we have a rocky shore, we get a nor'easter in here, and there's a lot of flooding along the edge of Marblehead. Businesses, homes get flooded. And so it's a real serious concern, but it's nice. I'd much rather know that something's coming than be surprised. So, and there's no reason anybody should be surprised.
Okay, I have the next question. It's from Dennis again. I believe most weather systems in the northern hemisphere move west to east or south to north. What is it about a hurricane that can move primarily from east to west?
From east to west, well, because most of them come off the Saharan desert. They start there. They're sort of born there. They come off and they spin up over the Azores. And then the trade winds, if you look at a map of the globe where the winds up here, off Massachusetts are going across to Europe. So that's the west to east that you're talking about, the jet stream. But down low where the Caribbean is, the prevailing winds are coming this way. So they're coming from the east to the west. So that's why. And what happens is when hurricanes and tropical storms come over here, they tend to either barrel into the Gulf Coast, or if they go up the coast, a lot of times they get slingshotted around the Bermuda High, which is around Bermuda. That's why it's called Bermuda High. And that'll sort of take the hurricane or storm up the East Coast and then off towards Europe, where it will die in the cold North Atlantic. The problem is the Bermuda High can shift. It's in different locations. It's different sizes. Sometimes there are low pressure systems on land. So like what happened in the hurricane of 1938 is the Bermuda High was further to the west, and there was a low pressure system coming in from the Great Lakes. So it created this corridor where there were two sets of weather systems that were essentially pushing this hurricane in the center straight up this corridor, and the corridor happened to strike New England and eastern tip of Long Island.
We have another question in the chat. Let's see. As a child, I remember talk of seeding hurricanes. What is that? Is it still used?
There's a great section in the book. I had a lot of fun writing it about all the crazy ideas that people have for stopping hurricanes or starting them. And there actually was a program where they used silver nitrate and what was the other one? I can't remember. But yes, they would seed clouds. There was an idea that if you seeded clouds or hurricanes, tropical storms, you could change their behavior and maybe cause them to ramp up or break them apart somehow. And there were numerous studies done in the 40s and 60s and 70s. And they basically found that no, there's nothing that we as puny humans flying over them, dropping flakes into the clouds to try to get them, try to suck energy out of it, get everything to coalesce and break it up by forming multiple thunderstorms in different locations, break up the symmetry of the hurricane itself or the tropical storm. We weren't able to do it. So we haven't done anything like that since. But there have been other recommendations. Some people, as we well know, have recommended that we drop nuclear bombs into hurricanes. But all that would do is create a lot of nuclear fallout. It wouldn't blow a hurricane apart. They're too massive. They're too powerful. Some people have thought we should have windmills on the coast that somehow could blow the hurricanes back out to sea. Other people have recommended getting a fleet of propeller planes to fly around the outside of the hurricane in the opposite direction to which it's swirling to sort of unwind the storm. Other people have said, why don't we just tow icebergs down to the Caribbean and cool the water off so we take the heat energy away from the hurricane. There are serious recommendations that I just saw in the news a couple of weeks ago. There's this one company who wants to put, very small bubbles, something on the surface of the ocean to help disrupt and cool off the ocean somehow. I don't know. There have been other people who have talked about putting pipes in the ocean that essentially will circulate the water. So all that warm water will be circulated with colder water taken from a deeper area. So you reduce the surface temperature of the ocean. There have been a lot of ideas. Nobody's come up with an idea that is going to demonstrably change the course or the strength of a hurricane. And it'd be kind of scary. We don't have a particularly good track record of messing with nature. So even if we come up with a way of somehow guiding a hurricane or destroying it, I worry about what the unintended consequences might be.
Very, it's interesting though, different ideas that people have come up with.
Yes. Oh yeah, people are very creative. One guy in the 1950s or 60s, he wrote to the Weather Bureau and he said, "I've got a great idea. My grandmother gave me this sort of incantation or prayer. Anyway, take me up in a plane and let me recite it, and it'll stop the hurricane." You get all sorts of ideas.
Wow.
Needless to say, they didn't do that.
Okay, well, I don't see more questions, so let's
Okay.
finish the evening. Could you give us an elevator speech on your next book, which is
Oh.
scheduled to be published in the beginning of 2022?
Yeah, my next book's going to be published in May of 2022, and it's on privateering during the American Revolution. I can't tell you the title. It's a good title because I never tell anybody the title until the cover of the book is done, and they're working on that right now. But it's a really fun book to write, and it basically is a book that looks at privateering and argues that it played a significant role in us winning the American Revolution, or at least surviving through the American Revolution. And it's got a lot of great New England stories, but also other stories of other colonies up and down the coast. There's a lot of great stuff about the politics and interactions between us and France and England and Spain. And there are great stories about prison ships in New York and prisons in England and how they treated all these American privateersmen who were captured. Anyway, there's a lot of fun writing. I think it's a really good book, and maybe I can come back to Nantucket and talk about that.
Well, fingers crossed, by spring of next year, we could have you back in person.
That would be great.
That would be a goal worth working towards.
Yes.
Well, thank you for coming to see us tonight and sharing your book, A Fear Sky.
Okay.
And, oh, wait, I think one last question in the chat. Is there anything? I can't.
It's is there anything good about a hurricane besides your book?
Oh.
No, hurricanes. Yeah. Is there anything good? Well, they're sort of a way of dissipating heat in the environment. They do it in a very violent way. So it's just like the conveyor belts between the equator and the Arctic help to equilibrate our environment. So if all the heat just kept building up and there weren't these release valves like hurricanes or winds going from south to north, who knows what the temperature of the earth would be or what would happen. But they're part of nature. I don't view them as bad. They're bad for us humans, yes, but they've been a part of nature since well before we were a factor, certainly in North America. And they help with welling up in the oceans, maybe circulation systems. Animals have learned to adapt. A lot of them get killed, but a lot of them can sense the hurricane coming because of pressure changes and changes in the ocean, and they protect themselves. But I guess from our perspective, our purely human perspective, there's not much good about hurricanes. And I think the only thing good about hurricanes is my book. That's it. Yeah, I agree with that.
It's like the perfect place to end the evening. So I think we'll stop there, and thanks again. And we'll see you next time in person.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Everybody have a good fall.
Thanks, Eric. Have a good night.
Okay, bye-bye.